The book of Isaiah opens with a notice that places the lifetime of the prophet Isaiah during the reigns of kings Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah of Judah. Specifically, Isaiah 6 places the beginning of Isaiah's prophetic activity in the year that King Uzziah died, conventionally dated to 742 BCE, and Isaiah 36 through 39 depicts Isaiah advising King Hezekiah during the Assyrian siege of Jerusalem, dated to 701 BCE. Now the Assyrians besieged Jerusalem in 701 BCE in response to Judah's rebellion against Assyrian control. Isaiah 39 describes Hezekiah entertaining a delegation from the Babylonian king Merodach-Baladan, who himself repeatedly rebelled against Assyrian rule, finding the most success in the period 721 to 709 BCE and again 705 to 703 BCE. Throughout the last half of the 8th century BCE, then, both Judah and Babylon were subservient to the Assyrian Empire, and for at least part of that time, Judah and Babylon were on friendly, perhaps even conspiratorial terms. It comes as some surprise, then, to read on from Isaiah 39, in which Judah and Babylon seem to be allied, or at least friendly, and to arrive in just a few pages at Isaiah 43 and find an antagonistic relationship between Babylon and Judah, with a claim that God will soon release Judean prisoners from Babylon. A few chapters later, prophetic oracles identify King Cyrus of Persia, also called Cyrus the Great, as the agent by which, the prophet says, God will take revenge on Babylon and bring that mighty empire to its knees. These oracles clearly presuppose events long after the lifetime of Isaiah son of Amoz. In the second half of the 7th century BCE, Assyrian power waned under pressure from the resurgent Babylonians to the south and from the Medes to the east. The Babylonians captured the Assyrian capital of Nineveh around 612 BCE and had decimated the last remnants of Assyrian power by 609 BCE. Control over Judah first passed to Egypt, but Babylon's victory over Egypt at the Battle of Carchemish in 605 BCE led to King Jehoiakim of Judah swearing loyalty to King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. Jehoiakim's loyalty didn't last long, however. Perhaps encouraged by Egyptian victories in battles against Babylon, Jehoiakim rebelled against Babylon around 600 BCE. The swift Babylonian response included, in 597 BCE, the deportation of Jehoiakim's son and successor, King Jehoiakim, along with other members of the royal family and the Jerusalem nobility. A second wave of deportations occurred around 586 BCE, after King Zedekiah of Judah, who had been installed by the Babylonians to succeed Jehoiakim, himself rebelled against Nebuchadnezzar around 590 BCE or so. Now these two deportations, along with a third in 582 BCE, ushered in a period that modern scholars tend to call Judah's Babylonian exile. New options opened up for the Judeans after 539 BCE, when King Cyrus of Persia captured Babylon, and thereafter allowed displaced populations to migrate back to their ancestral homelands. So why does the book of Isaiah suddenly switch from an Assyrian-era perspective in chapters 1 through 39 to a late Babylonian-era perspective in chapters 40 and following? While many Jewish and Christian believers would affirm God's power to grant Isaiah son of Amoz visions of the distant future, and might picture Isaiah writing down long oracles that would not be relevant for another 150 years, such would depart pretty dramatically from the norm for other 8th century prophets and for Isaiah's activities as depicted in Isaiah 1 through 39, in which prophetic oracles apply pretty immediately to the prophet's own time and space. Moreover, chapters 40 and following don't sound like prophecies of future events, but seem to address realities contemporary with the speaker, as a matter of style. Therefore, the medieval Jewish scholar Abraham ibn Ezra, who was born around 1089 CE in Spain and died around 1164 CE, proposed that Isaiah 40 through 66 stemmed from the work of a prophet other than the 8th century Isaiah son of Amoz. In Ibn Ezra's view, the oracles of Isaiah 40 through 66 must have come from someone living through the events of the Babylonian exile, someone living in the period, say, 586 to 538 BCE. Modern scholars now refer to this otherwise anonymous prophet as Deutero-Isaiah or 2nd Isaiah. That name also applies to chapters 40 through 55 of the book of Isaiah as a literary unit. Centuries later, in 1892, a German scholar named Bernhard Dohm published a commentary on the book of Isaiah, in which he argued that chapters 56 through 66 come from a still later period than chapters 40 through 55. Chapter 55 seems to still consider Judah's release from Babylonian captivity to be an event in the near future from the perspective of the speaker, while chapters 56 and 66 seem to presuppose the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem, a project undertaken only after the Judeans began to migrate from Babylon to Jerusalem after 538 BCE. In fact, the temple building itself mostly took place in the period 520 to 515 BCE. Since the speaker in chapters 56 and 66 seems to regard the rebuilding of the temple as something in progress or already completed, Dohm reasoned, using logic similar to Ibn Ezra's, that the author or authors of those passages lived in the latter part of the 6th century BCE, or even later. Chapters 56 through 66 are now often called Trito-Isaiah or 3rd Isaiah as a literary unit, but it's probably best not to apply that term to a person, as is often done with Deutero-Isaiah or 2nd Isaiah. The material in chapters 56 through 66 is much less unified than the material in either chapters 1 through 39 or chapters 40 through 55, and seems not to all derive from the preaching of a single prophet. Indeed, various passages in chapters 56 through 66 could have originated anywhere from about 520 BCE down to about 450 BCE. To summarize, nowadays most biblical scholars accept the following three-part view of the book of Isaiah. The oracles and narratives in Isaiah 1 through 39 mostly derive from the preachings and experiences of Isaiah son of Amoz, a prophet who lived in 8th century BCE Jerusalem and was actively prophesying from 742 to 701 BCE. During this period, Judah's foreign relations were overshadowed by its relations with the Assyrian Empire. The oracles in Deutero-Isaiah or 2nd Isaiah, chapters 40 through 55, mostly derive from the preaching of an otherwise anonymous prophet living during the Judeans' exile in Babylon, probably most active during the decade from 550 to 540 BCE. That judgment is based on the things that the prophet seems to presuppose his audience knows about. The primary audience of Isaiah 40 through 55 seems to be Judeans living in exile in Babylon, although scholars debate whether the prophet actually lived in Babylon or somewhere else. Finally, the oracles in Trito-Isaiah or 3rd Isaiah, chapters 56 through 66, post-date 538 BCE, and some may be as late as the 440s BCE. These oracles treat different problems and issues arising in the Judean community in and around Jerusalem during the 1st century of Persian rule. No matter what one concludes about the historical authorship of the book of Isaiah, the literary divisions that I've described here are really very clear and very useful. Now, just like a movie trilogy like Star Wars, for example, the book of Isaiah does have an overarching thematic unity that binds all the parts together. Nevertheless, these three pieces that I've described are demarcated pretty clearly in the content and assumptions of the book, and so it's very helpful to realize that the three divisions address audiences or issues or problems of Judeans living in three very distinct time periods.